So after its delay into 2025, we finally have some more information about Assassin's Creed Shadows with the drop of a trailer discussing PC specs and current gen console information. And there's also a blog posted with a Q&A from the engineering team there, discussing a lot about the individual technology pieces here. And I thought this was actually a pretty cool, very transparent way to get information across, specifically about the PC version here, as well as a Mac version as listed in those specs, which is, I almost feel like that's a video in its own right when the time comes. Like, what is like an M4 running like next to a PC GPU? That should be some interesting stuff. There's a lot going on here. But let's first talk about some of the tech. We kind of knew this a bit beforehand based on comments last year from, I believe, one of the tech directors on the game, but the game will be utilizing ray traced global illumination. And now we see ray traced reflections there on the highest setting. And going through the trailer, this is interesting because I do not think it is a per pixel GI solution.
Nope.
Based upon what we saw in Skull and Crossbones, what's that
Skull
name?
and Bones.
Skull and Bones.
Close.
Which, I don't know. Not a very good game, but it did give us a glimpse at what is coming into Anvil next. Back then when it did release, and it did have an RTGI ray tracing option, which curiously only affected your ship, and it looked to be a probe-based solution. So that'd be putting it, we've seen probe-based RTGI on consoles now. I think some titles that used it quite well would be like The Witcher's remastering for current gen consoles that used it, The Witcher 3, that is. There's another title that I'm forgetting off the top of my head at the moment. Oh, yeah, Jedi. Jedi also does it too. A more recent one that I'm forgetting. But so it can look good and it can be transformative to the visuals, and especially in a game like this one where it seems that they're going to be, first of all, time of day obviously is a big reason for that. But another thing is that this game also has, I believe, the 4 seasons are in it, so you can't use the baked GI information when the terrain is all white, covered in snow. It makes a lot of sense that you can't do that. So they also specifically call out an area of the game that I forget what it's called, but basically an area that only works with real-time lighting in general that needs to have some sort of RTGI solution.
The hideout.
The hideout, excuse me. Yes, that scene. Well, we'll all have to see what that is like when the game ships, and I'll talk about a little bit more with the PC specs. The game is also using virtualized geometry, and they have images of this where you can see what looks like clusters, or I don't know, the ID of the exact, they have multicolored IDs to different areas of the image where you can see like the geometry, and you'll notice that it is affecting the areas that seem to be covered by virtual geometry are like the static world structures in terms of like buildings, as well as it looks like distant terrain might be done using this virtualized geometry system. And we'll have to see what it means more when we get to the title, but kind of like earlier Unreal Engine 5 games where nanite wasn't applied to everything, I think that's kind of what we're going to be seeing here, where some things like especially bushes and characters and maybe some environmental debris are not using this system based upon this image here. And so you'll see more traditional level of details changing with them. But for the things using the virtualized geometry system, we'll see a much more fine-grained level of detail. It's kind of called out on the blog as well, too. That will give them a really static and consistent look no matter how far away the camera is and how quickly it moves and stuff like that. So that's what I'm thinking there. There's some more tech in there too. They talk about destruction. We'll see how much that plays into an Assassin's Creed title, but that's interesting as well to see there too. But I think the PC specs were also very interesting. They call out requirement of an SSD. They very nicely call out as well resolution and frame rate, which I'm a big fan of in spec sheets like this. They do mention in the blog that the game, you should probably be playing this with a ray tracing capable GPU, but they do have a selective ray tracing option that will use I believe, static GI for the overworld. And then if you don't have an RT-GI, an RT-capable GPU, it will use a software-based GI solution for that one area, the hideout, that requires real-time lighting. I think that is an interesting compromise. We'll actually have to see how viable it is in terms of frame rate and visuals when the game comes out. But it is much more realistic, I would say, and it's not the first time we're seeing this, where a probe-based solution can also have a software fallback. In fact, the original DDGI paper, this is probably basing its technology on, I think that's Morgan McGuire, did talk about how for lower end components, it's really easy, not easy, it's still expensive to do the tracing of rays in a software form. So there's a lot there. I think this game could be pretty great. I think some of the trailer didn't look as good as perhaps the tech notes described. Like, I do think the GI is a little bit coarse, not as fine-grained as I would like, but I'm very curious to see what those reflections look like. And like any Assassin's Creed game, my goodness, they are monsters on your CPU. I want to see what it takes to actually get this game to 60 in the more dense areas. If you're really looking at only X3D territory there, as well as what the heck is going on consoles. And Oliver, what is going on consoles here?
Yeah, so there's some interesting stuff they're specifying on consoles. They're talking about a 4K 60 mode on consoles using upscaling without ray tracing in typical play. Again, falling back on that, I think, pre-computed GI solution that they have had in some prior Anvil engine games. And that 4K 60 mode, it's very curious because that's a really high resolution. You know, normally you'd think
it's really high.
Maybe a 1440p target or a 1080p target, even with upscaling for a current generation game, pushing out more advanced visuals here. That's a little bit curious. I also did pixel count the Pro version of the game last year. Did not look so good there with PSSR, unfortunately, in that early showing. And it was about 864p internally. So that would, you know, again, that's kind of like maybe this is 720p territory, maybe it's 800p territory to 4K with FSR2. Again, does not sound like a recipe for success here unless they've uncovered some brand new upscaling technology that they've yet to reveal to the world. But it's not too promising there necessarily. And it is a little bit confusing too, because this class of GPU that's in the PS5 and Series X should be good for something closer to 1080p 60 at medium settings with DRS and upscaling according to the PC settings. Because if you look at the PC settings, something like a 3060 Ti or a 6700 XT, again, maybe a little faster than the consoles, but roughly in that ballpark, maybe of console performance, those are 1080p 60, only 1080p 60, and that's with the selective ray tracing, which again is kind of like not really ray tracing, it's ray tracing in one area. So that's confusing.
And not the rest, yeah.
But again, there are some factors here that make this like kind of a befuddling spec sheet, because like I'm all for using upscaling in your game. Use upscaling in your game. When you're playing your game, use upscaling, you know? I'm all for using dynamic resolution, right? But when you combine upscaling and dynamic resolution on a spec sheet, all of a sudden you've told me very little about the way the game actually performs. So you're telling me that this GPU in a console is good for 4K 60 with DRS, but in a PC it's only good for 1080p 60 with DRS? Like, again,
that's a discrepancy.
We're losing track here. Now, of course, you could say, well, maybe PC, it's more often at 1080p. Maybe on consoles it's 720p. There are some things you could explain here, but again, it's just adding confusion to the end user. And I really wish, at least on that PC side, you know, if you're going to specify upscaling, then specify the modes, right? Specify, is it performance, ultra performance, balance, quality, whatever. And don't specify DRS, because even though DRS is great for the player, it's not great for someone reading a spec sheet. Anyways, just a couple little quibbles there, but it does make this a little bit confusing, unfortunately. So unless the PC version is like exceptionally bad, you should expect some different scaling here than stated on PC, I have to imagine, at least based on the spec sheet. They don't talk about the 30 FPS mode in any detail, but maybe it could have a hardware RTGI. That's not discussed here. It's kind of implied almost if you're saying that the non-RTGI version is a 60 FPS performance mode on consoles.
Right.
The indirect lighting didn't blow me away necessarily. That was also true in last year's showing. But we haven't seen that much of the game so far. I don't really know. But again, in every shot here, I wasn't like getting that like per pixel RTGI impression that you get out of a game like, let's say, Metro Exodus, where you really do see that fine per pixel, fine-grained lighting detail, like not a path trace game, but a really nice game with really nice indirect diffuse lighting. That's not necessarily the case here. Early days, but that's not too great. But outside of the console minutia, they also published some Mac specs. So the Mac specs have some of the same frustrations as I do with the PC specs, unfortunately here, because they specify both METAL-FX upscaling and dynamic resolution for all these figures here. And they don't specify what settings METAL-FX is running at, or even if it's the temporal version of METAL-FX, which is quite good, or the spatial upscaler in METAL-FX, which, as you might expect, is not very good. Actually, it looks quite bad. It's a little bit worse than FSR1 in my opinion, in my experience. And across the board, they're only specifying a 30 FPS frame rate, not a 60 FPS frame rate. Across the board, they're only specifying a 30 FPS frame rate, not 60, even on the highest end hardware they have specified here, which is like really confusing to me, because the M3 and the M4 in particular have like sky-high single-core CPU performance. They're the fastest CPUs on the planet in terms of single-core CPU performance. That's a little confusing to me. And the top end of that range too, the M4 Max, M3 Max, whatever, those also have very, very high multi-core performance. So why would hitting 60 be that big of an issue? Plus, there's no support for the extended RT, so no support for the ray trace reflections. That's another concern there. But yeah, the performance tiers are also a little bit worrying. Again, not to rant too much, but my M1 Ultra chip is apparently only good for 1080p 30 with software selective RT, aka no RT really, which is confusing. And that's with DRS and upscaling. 1080p 30 for an M1 Ultra. This was a very expensive chip, and it's a very large chip. It's actually two 400 millimeter squared chips put together over a silicon interposer. It's quite a beefy chip there. And with respect to PCs, like in synthetics, it can be as fast as like a 3080 or even a 3090. In games on Mac, it's more often like 3060, 3070 level. The other thing to note here is that for any kind of hardware RT, just the RTGI, no extended RT here, you need an M3 or an M4 chip. But of course, you have to remember that the M2 and M1 Mac chips do not have hardware RT support. It's only the M3 and M4 chips. So anything after like 2023, any Mac after 2023 would have gotten those chips. My Mac does not have those chips. It has an M1 Ultra. And it does not support any a Mac prior to Apple Silicon. It's just distributed as a binary compatible with Apple Silicon here. There's no Intel Mac version. That's another thing. So I have two explanations possibly for this issue to close it out here. One is maybe because Macs don't have VRR displays by default. Maybe they're not too confident that the Macs can hit 60 FPS there consistently. Because if a game does go over budget, you can drop a frame there, and that can be more impactful to your gameplay experience. Whereas on PC, maybe they're more comfortable with dropping a couple frames there and still saying it's a 60 FPS experience. Now, The Macs do have variable refresh rate displays in some sense. They just cycle between a number of fixed refresh rates, I believe, using the ProMotion technology, which is also what you see on the phones. So they can do like 80 hertz, 120 hertz, 60 hertz, 30 hertz, 40 hertz, 15 hertz, whatever. But they can't do a full variable refresh rate cycling based on the content there. And the Pro Display XDR and the Studio Display, which I have in front of me right here, they're just flat 60 hertz panels. So Apple does not sell any VRR displays as far as I'm aware, even though the ProMotion technology is frequently confused with PC VRR. It's not the same. Macs do support VRR, but not on the displays that Apple sells. The other possibility is that the Mac ports just aren't that great, as we saw with Mirage and iPhone. But of course, the third possibility that maybe is even a little bit more plausible here is that the specs are just a big overestimate, and Mac hardware is much closer to similarly spec PC hardware, because, I don't know, the PC and console spec is so out of whack that I'm just like, how reliable are these specs really? What am I supposed to read from these specs? And of course, the big obfuscatory fact in all this is that everything's listed with DRS and upscaling. So it's just a slight frustration. But I don't know what you have to think about that, Alex, but it's just frustrating.
My frustration is, it's a very typical thing that you see when they talk about games. And we'll see this sometimes too when we try and interact with PR about games to get a better sense about like what the consoles are doing. And they'll say the game's running at 4K, and they'll say it's using like the PC Ultra settings or high settings. And then poor, Alex goes into the game and he does the comparison. And it's like PC low, and it's actually running, sub 720p, the way developers PR talks about consoles is usually very different than the product you end up getting in a lot of ways. Very rarely are they super descriptive because they want to sell the fact that it is the latest and the greatest thing running ever on a console that only costs X amount of money. So that's kind of what I think might be happening here on the console side. They're not giving out as much information because kind of like Skull and Bones, that game also ran really poorly in its 60 FPS mode in terms of like just what you were getting visually out of it. So we'll have to see when the game comes out, but I would not be surprised if what you're getting visually out of the consoles here lines up a lot more with that PC spec, but they just are putting it in a way that makes it look a lot better. The max spec thing though, I'm really curious if this is one of those games that was more automatically translated to the Mac platform to,
it is a native Apple Silicon port. They do say that. So it
is.
Yeah, it should
they do
be,
say
it's
that.
It's not crossover or wine or anything.
Well, then the 30 FPS thing is confusing then, because you would expect from the CPU side they would at least, if you're still getting like 1440p 30, you could give a 1080p 60 spec then,
right?
As well, right?
Yeah.
Like they do with the PC side. Yet they don't do that. So I don't even know what the heck that means. I don't know. Do you have any clue here, Tom?
Well, I like looking over the Q&A section on Assassin's Creed Shadows. I do think there's a big need for transparency on what exact settings they're using, especially with the DRS setups there. I actually got to see the game myself at a preview event, and the embargo's already well past. We didn't do anything with the footage in the end, I don't believe, but it was like, I think for two main reasons. It was they gave us we were able to capture gameplay, go there, capture PC gameplay on an RTX 4090, but there were no visibility on the settings. They just gave you like, oh, this is a demo build with preset settings for everything. So it was hard to parse exactly what we were getting out of it, but you'd assume it's like the best they had to offer. Whether the ray tracing features were already enabled there is like remains to be seen. But also they gave us so that was 60 FPS at 1080p native. So I was like,
what on earth with a 4090? Oh my gosh,
on a 4090. So I thought that's maybe not, that's really useful for most YouTube channels, but for Digital Foundry purposes, not quite where we need it to be. But they also gave us B-roll, which was 4K. 4K, 60 FPS, and I presume running on the RTX 4090, and it looks really beautiful. Like this thing was divided into two segments, this demonstration, and I think it's got to be it is the best looking Assassin's Creed, as you'd hope. It definitely surpasses Odyssey and Valhalla in that respect. It's like, it feels like a bit of not a full generational leap, maybe like a 33%, 50% step. And you get just it does look incredible. Partly owed to the setting, feudal Japan, but also partly because they're really honing in on this story focus with the two main characters who you can switch between. And they open out this whole thing with a really linear, like more visually focused set piece, like set in like a dark area, a dark sort of siege on a settlement, and there's lots of great shadow work. There's like a lot of battles within contained areas where they can really push what the Anthem engine can do in sort of more restricted areas before you go out in the second part of this demo and do the usual Assassin's Creed thing of traveling across the open world and, carving your own path through the adventure. But so yeah, it was a strange preview in terms of gleaning what exactly we're getting out of the game on PC. So none the wiser on that. I think console will be very telling in terms of what we're, whether GI will be included across the whole game or if it's just one area, the hideout area. But,
It is a weird omission, though, the hideout being it, and then the static solution apparently for everything else, which, I mean, based upon their description about how the settings are such a big part of the game, I wonder if there's going to be a very large visual discrepancy at that point, too, for turning it on. which could make it really worthwhile and great, but it would also leave all those people looking for a 60 FPS mode getting a much more visually inferior game. But oh my gosh, those are all things we're going to have to see in about a month's time when we do cover this on PC, console, and hopefully Mac. That'd be awesome to get some more Mac coverage, especially if something like this where we look at that spec sheet and we're like, what is this?